Okay, so in the last video we spoke a little bit about what this machine needs to be. Now let's start to remove pieces that are human compatible. So the first things to go should probably be things like these foot pegs. Don't need those. Don't need these guards here either. Shifters, no need for shifters. It's a brake pedal. It's going to be actuated somehow. As we start to peel some of the components away from this model, we're going to see that there are a few gaps left. When I'm creating these kinds of bikes, I don't model every single detail, because I'm not going to waste time modeling things that viewers are never going to see. If we uncover any of those gaps, we'll just close them up. So the front end is interesting. This is going to be a really heavy machine. 1800cc engine, blades, robotics, telemetry, equipment, all sorts of stuff bolted onto this frame. So I think we're going to have to beef up the front end a little bit, put some better brakes on it. For that, I've actually got a second stand-in motorcycle that I'm willing to salvage parts from. It's my generic sport bike model. So this model is going to be nice to get the beefy front brakes from. Now, even though this model is a HyperNurbs model, if you turn HyperNurbs off like it is right now, the geometry detail level is quite similar. I'll just hide that for now. So let's start getting rid of this front fairing. I'm just sort of drilling down and taking a look at what we have here. Oftentimes when you have a symmetry object in Cinema 4D, it can hide the nature of the underlying geometry. For instance, here I have this object selected, but for some reason the symmetry object is preventing it from being visible. If I move it around, it's definitely selected. I think if I go to my side viewport and do sort of a marquee selection, I can get some of the stuff I need to get rid of. None of this is any good to a machine. Mirrors, don't need them. Screws, not for something that doesn't exist anymore. Now, triple trees. Here's an interesting part. I'm going to leave the bars, but remove everything that's attached to them. Throttle, clutch, all that stuff is going to be hydraulically actuated from inside of the machine. So we can leave the front brake. Nope, front brake line has to go as well. It's going to be replaced when we swap in a new front end. The reason I'm going to leave the bars is because we still need a way to steer the machine. And that's where these bars are going to come in. So I'm just going to run the optimize command here. I'm going to configure it to only remove unused points. So we get rid of these orphaned vertices here in space. And then if I select, let's see, rectangular selection, all elements, that way if I select these points, I can just pull it into a little stub. That's all we're going to need. Likewise on this end, I think these two objects have the same coordinate system. So we should actually be able to copy and paste the value. So it's 3.192 on the Y. So that means in this instance, probably needs to be negative 3192. Wrong. Actually, no. No, that is correct. The clutch lever confused me. Clutch cable is going to be actuated by machine, but we still want the cable coming down here just for effect, just to add some clutter. Let's take a look at how that clutch cable is formed. Looks like it's in two separate pieces. So I'm just going to select the part of the cable that resides up here. Just get rid of it. And we're starting to get a platform that looks a little bit more fit to mount robotics on. Airbox. On the Buell motorcycles, the fuel tank is not where you think it is. There's a space in the frame that holds fuel. You can see the fuel cap is actually connected to the frame, not the tank. So what we can do is simply remove the tank, because at this point the tank is just an airbox cover. The airbox is the sort of the part of the machine that feeds the carburetors. Now, it's all one shell here in my model, which is probably just a bit of an inaccuracy. But to fix that, we can do some patchwork. So we select the frame. Just the frame. There we go. So now we can start to move these vertices around. What I'd like to do is bring them up so that they're flush with this fuel cap. It's probably how it should have been all along. So from the side view, I'm going to move these vertices up. So if we go back to the camera view, it looks like that. If we go to the side view again, we can see that the next set of vertices that would need to rise are these. So maybe this isn't the right way to do it. Maybe you just pull this back to give us enough real estate there, because we have a lot of license here to do what we want. This is a fictional machine. Doesn't really play by the rules of today. So these two vertices here need to come back to this region. And at this point we can start to smooth things out. Now whenever modeling on an axis that isn't straight, this is an incline, we have to remember we can't move things back and forth on the perpendicular axes. They don't follow the contour like you think they would, so we have to move them back in the side view. We can actually just open the viewports up side by side, and then select in one viewport, move in the other. It's not the most elegant thing, but it gets the job done. So now that we have more surface area here, whether we're being accurate or not, we should be able to select the fuel cap and move it down. Rotate it into place. We've sort of patched it into something that can work. We're probably going to cover the entire top of the machine here in the gimbal arms that hold the blades. feel like chuckling a little bit every time I talk about it because it's such a ridiculous project. It should be fun. So we can take our seat. See, it's a symmetry object. I just break it apart. And we can get rid of that. So what we've got left is this rare cowl, which I'd like to keep. And we have, looks like some filler object that I left back. I put this black, pure black object in the bike in areas where you might see through the geometry. It just sort of helps sell the effect. But in this case, you can see this object here. It's just a sheet of geometry coming up. In this case, we can remove this edge, trim it down a little bit, and we get something like that. Now there will be stuff here where the rear suspension is. I suppose this is a bit of a problem because we need to bend the rules a little bit. While the Buell is a good platform for this, we need to take into account that the Buell's suspension does attach here. So what I'd like to do is move the suspension outboard and then put the flywheel where the suspension is right now. The flywheel is probably going to be the first major component we work on because it helps create some of the I guess what I'm trying to say is it helps create some of the dominant masses of the model. Because once we have that flywheel in place, we'll have a much better idea of what exactly we're working with. So, I am moving a bit clunky. The screen capture software slows down the machine that I'm working on, and it is difficult to speak and do this modeling at the same time, but I think it'll be good in the end. I think I'll just have to slow my pace so that I move a little bit more slowly in the program. Okay. The outside piece here, but I'm not sure what this object is right here. I do know that it needs to go. Okay, so this is part of the inner tail. So this part is underneath the tail and it fills that gap. We want to keep that, but we don't actually want it to have a hump here like it does. The reason it has that hump is because of the suspension. So what I'm going to do, got a little out of control there. So what I'm going to do is basically just start cutting pieces away. We don't need that. We probably still need these pieces at the side. But I think we can get away with removing this piece that I've just selected. As you can see here, the geometry is not perfect. This was a contract model. I created this model for a magician. He needed a model of a Buell to help visualize a trick involving a motorcycle. I'm not sure why he needed a Buell specifically, but to be honest, I was more than happy to create the model because I'd never created a Buell. It's a fun bike to explore, and my point is that it was on a pretty tight schedule. I didn't have the time available to make everything perfect, nor did everything have to be perfect. So can't just delete that vertice. I need to delete the edges that connect to it. And I probably have to collapse this edge here. There we go. So I'm starting to just clean things up a little bit because we are going to be working in this space a little bit later. There's going to be a huge piece of machinery. Now we can see the rest of this filler that I had, filler object. The filler object is probably going to have to be trimmed. So I'm going to delete these two edges so that it only goes up to here. You can see some of the some of the hoses and engine parts poking through. It's just all part of the illusion. It's got to go somewhere. Oftentimes when I create these bikes, I've never actually seen one in real life, so I'm not 100% sure what it needs to look like. What I do know is that this shock unit needs to move. So it looks like when I was modeling this, I kept it all as one group, very nice and neat. So I should just be able to slide that outboard. I'm going to want it in this area. Perhaps I can move it in a little bit, and then we can adjust this cowl so that it's sort of, no, because we're going to want that space for the flywheel. This is the part of the process where I'm not really sure what to do. We have to have some sort of a suspension unit. This machine, because you've got the exhaust underneath the engine, there's probably not enough space to put the suspension there. But I have an idea. What if we were to take the shock unit and mount it vertically? This is normally where someone's leg would go. But we don't have a leg on this machine. It's piloted by a robot, by computer code. So we can just mount the shock outboard right there. Oh, here's some more stuff we don't need. We don't need the lever for shifting. The bike will still shift, maybe. So we still need this shift arm. But it'll probably connect to an actuator of some sort. So you've got the shock unit here. Now, normally the swing arm pivots like that. The goal is going to be to get this to compress the spring somehow. I think I have an idea on how to do that. This may actually be a good time to steal the shock unit from the other bike that I brought. Because again, you could never see the top of this shock unit, so I never bothered to model it. On this machine, I believe we have a full unit modeled. So let's take a look at the shock. So it looks like we have the top part of the shock, the lower part, as well as the spring. Let's take that bolt. Let's also take this pivot. I'm going to need that. Nope, I'll model my own pivot. And let's take this adjuster, this bolt. We're going to have our own mount for the shock, so that's less important. And we need these lock rings. Now, I should just be able to remove this from the bike. And we have a much more complete unit. So I'm going to group that, cut, and paste. I like how the cut and paste feature works in Cinema 4D. So now we have a new shock unit. You can probably invert the unit so that the reservoir down here can be pointed inboard, like that. Save us some real estate. No, we're just doing all this by looking. There's no guarantee that this would actually work. Actually, it probably wouldn't. You'd need to tune the geometry of a suspension system a lot before it actually does its job. So it looks like we actually have a reservoir for the swing arm right here. I'm wondering if we have more space on the other side. Nope, we have a belt tensioner. Let's go back to the original plan. Let's put this along the frame. That way the reservoir can exist right there. Just sort of point inwards a little bit. and we can actually have our shock parallel to the axis of the bike. We can bolt it to the frame there, and then we can actually have a part coming off of the swing arm that'll actually serve as our pivot. I'm not sure how I'm going to do that yet, so we'll cross that bridge a little bit later. For now, let's get rid of this extra geometry and patch the swing arm. Now in the novel, the daemon essentially, I guess the right word would be, hires a machine shop. In exchange for the latest equipment and protection, he starts giving machine shops state-of-the-art equipment. He can essentially send a design via email, and a rapid prototype machine starts making it. So I'm going to assume that the tooling required to make all these modifications would be a part of those plans. Meaning that when the daemon orders a part, it actually comes along with instructions that actually says, okay, cut this part, use this tool to fasten this part of the swing arm to the other part, seal it with this material when you're done so the oil doesn't leak, etc. So we have a shock unit now. I have a noisy keyboard, I know. You're going to be hearing a lot of it. So I'm going to, oh, look at that. We can bring the unit down, adjust its alignment a little bit, and we can probably bolt it right there and right there. This is very similar to the, I want to say the Kawasaki Ninja 650R. It has a shock unit that's off to one side. Also the Aprilia Shiver, or the SM750, those also have a shock unit that's off to one side. So that shouldn't be a problem. Lots of folks do it. So I got rid of the kickstand. We're not going to need a kickstand. This machine has a much more sophisticated method of stopping itself from falling over. This flywheel is one of them. I guess it would use gyroscopic forces to stabilize itself. So the guys at the machine shop would probably be requested to remove the tail light, but I'm going to leave it. Although these machines probably communicate with each other via Wi-Fi or some other short-range communication method, it would be interesting to think that they could detect the presence of tail lights. That way they could react to a stopping vehicle in front of them without having to use the radar systems to detect it. So let's leave the tail light. The autonomous machine actually does have a tail light, but how about this? It only activates the tail light when it knows other Razorbacks are in range. So at this point we've almost gotten rid of all of the hardware. I'm trying to think for a second. I'm wondering what else we need to remove. I think that's about it for now. What does concern me though is this front brake system. The Buell has this almost an outboard rotor. So the rotor is very large. It's connected to the edge of the rim. It's very reminiscent of like a Tron light cycle. It's got this tiny little hub on the front wheel, and I don't think we're going to be able to use these. We might be able to use the design of having the ring on the outboard side, but my goal here is not to create some sort of a concept futuristic sort of vehicle. You know, this story takes place in present day, and currently all of the machines that have outboard hubless, all the hubless motorcycles and the other machines with some sort of crazy drive system, well, they're not very fast, they're not very maneuverable, they're not reliable, and a Razorback needs to be fast, maneuverable, and reliable. So I'm going to use this front end. It looks a lot beefier. It's because it is. And I'm just going to start the process of removing it. I'm going to start with a marquee just to see if I can grab all the components I need in one fell swoop. Looks like I got it. Left behind a bolt or two. Let's try that again. So this time I'm going to take a bit more. I got the fairing, but I can deselect that. It looks like I also got the inside of the fairing. I can deselect that. Now I have the forks. If I'm going to take the lower forks, I might as well grab the upper forks here as well. There's a lot of nice detail on the generic sport bike in this range, in this region. The reason is because I stupidly wanted to make this entire machine subdividable, which meant every nut, every bolt needed to be constructed all of quads, which means there's a lot more detail than there really needs to be. It's a good and a bad thing, but that's just the way it is. So we have all of the geometry necessary for the front end of the generic sport bike. We can group that up. We'll just call that front end. And I'm going to move the axis center of our new group. And I'm going to rotate it. There we go. Let's move it into place. You can immediately see that the Buell uses a different rake and trail setup. And that's okay. We can stay with whatever the Buell offered. That is our platform. So I'm going to align the top part of the shock, move my pivot point to the top triple tree, and then I can rotate the entire front end into place, just like that. And then I probably need to move it up so that it matches the wheel size a little bit better. Because I make most of these models from photographs, each one is a little bit different. Even though I know a motorcycle tire is supposed to be 17 inches. I think it's 17. I believe MotoGP uses an 18-inch rear wheel. And sport bikes typically have a 17-inch wheel. I'm actually going to try to keep the Buell rim. Maybe we can modify it so that it just has a bigger hub. It's the cool thing about this. We can bend the rules a lot. So we just got rid of the tire and rim from the generic sport bike. But I'm gonna bring back the rim for 1 second. If we're gonna use the rim of the tire from the Buell, but the front suspension from the generic sport bike, we're actually going to have to align the axle. So this is the Buell tire. I'm just going to cut and paste it so I get it out here in this hierarchy. And this is the Buell rim. So I'm going to cut and paste it so it's out here in the hierarchy. So at this point I can make the front tire a child of the front wheel object. And I can move the wheel around. Now this represents the front rim of the generic sport bike. Its coordinates are here. The Buell wheel coordinates are very different. So what I need to do is use the transfer tool. I have it set to a keyboard shortcut of minus. And I'm going to take the front wheel for the Buell and I'm going to transfer it to the front rim. And you just saw it jump really quickly. That was the transfer being completed. So now we can take the front rim of the generic sport bike and delete it. So it just about fits. We have two front fenders now. Let's keep the front fender from the generic sport bike. A little bit of trivia, that's actually a front fender from a Daytona 675, but modified slightly. Alright, we have two sets of front suspension. Let's get rid of one. The Buell suspension is the short squat set right here. And it's got a bracket for the brakes. Let's get rid of that. And I'm going to hide the front end object so we can see if we left anything behind, and indeed we did. There's another object down here. Let's get rid of that. So now what we're left with is a Buell front wheel, a Buell triple tree, and the front end components from the generic sport bike. It looks like a really tight fit on the front fender. So it's the first thing we'll tweak. Front fender right here. I'm just gonna drag a marquee around these points and just move it up. We have a lot of freedom in what we do here because this doesn't need to match any reference material. It's all in my head. Okay. The last thing that we should do is make sure that the rotors actually connect to the hub. And because the Buell has such a puny hub, it probably does not. So if we zoom in really tight here, we can see that the hub sort of intersects the rotors a little bit. Let's hide the front end, select our front wheel, and figure out how we're going to destroy this thing. Easiest thing to do would be to use a loop selection like that. A pair of loop selections actually, to set our boundaries. Then we use the fill tool, fill selection, to select those polygons, these polygons right here, get rid of them. Let's repeat for this side. Loop selection, fill selection, delete. And now that we've deleted it, we have this hub, I guess, sort of a shaft I left there. Now we can fill these two polygon holes. 1, 2. Select them. Unhide our front end. And then we can just scale it up so it connects to the rotors. Voila! I think this is a good stopping point. We've accomplished quite a bit. The bike is now ready for extra components. The front end has been beefed up because the whole theme of this motorcycle is intense modification. Weight is going to be a big problem. We've remedied some of that. So we have big brakes, a big front wheel, the same front wheel, big brakes, big forks. These are inverted forks. I don't think the Buell forks were inverted. Inverted forks are good because the more rigid tube on front suspension is the outer tube, thick one. When you're under extreme braking on a sport bike, or on a dirt bike, on any bike I suppose, there is a bit of flex in the forks. They actually do bend back and forth. And you often see it when guys are doing stoppies, those tricks that stunt riders do where they go up on the front wheel and they just sort of roll there to a stop. You can actually see the front suspension bending if you get a good photograph of it. Inverted suspension, inverted meaning in the old days the skinny chrome tube used to be up on top and the fat anodized aluminum tube, the outer tube, used to be down low. And what that meant is that you had a longer skinny tube and a shorter fat tube. So in other words, you were building more of your front suspension out of the more flexible material and less of it out of the more rigid material. And then they decided, well, let's flip it upside down. Let's put the telescoping smaller tube down at the bottom And up here, let's put the rigid part. It just helps make the entire suspension system, front suspension system of the bike a lot more rigid and easier to control. In this case, it probably doesn't matter since this bike isn't real, but it's fun to treat it as if it is real. I think that's one of the tricks when doing 3D like this. You need to buy into it. You need to actually believe that this thing is real. So I want to move these points down, but I want to move them along a certain axis. I think I can do that if I select the points. I'm still learning this new version of Cinema 4D. If I select the points, I can then sort of hold L to get into the axis modification mode. Move the axis how I want it. No, that didn't quite do it. Maybe my axis isn't oriented properly. I should be able to move it based on the axis of the front end group, because that axis is rotated. So it should be right here. But maybe it's because these objects don't have the same axis orientation. Let's see what we can do about that. If I go to the axis modification tool, select all the objects I want to deal with, because they are children of the front end object, which is rotated, I should be able to adjust their pitch. Nope. Maybe in the coordinates. No. One at a time? This is puzzling. Ah. So I can match their coordinate. So 20.332. If I select all these guys, I change it to 20.332, it moves their axes. But now they're all over the place. Maybe I can do it in the coordinate manager. It actually rotates them. Let's just do this the old school way. One at a time. So it actually doesn't need to be 20.332. Yeah, I'm slightly confused about this. This happens to me sometimes when I bring geometry in from a different from a different file. I mean, I'll be honest, I'm really not sure why this isn't working. But I do know a trick. If we duplicate the upper forks object, we can just eyeball it. So we select all these objects, deselect the duplicate, and then as we move we have a guide. So we know as long as we stay lined up here, we'll be alright. Yes, it's not 100% accurate, but it's good enough. So we know we stayed in line there. Now we can get rid of the guide. Now this video is starting to run pretty long. I want to keep these videos, definitely I want to try to keep them under an hour. And we see we have a big space for our flywheel, because there is documentation in the book that talks about the flywheel. And they described it as being where the rider normally is. So it'll be right there. Sort of try to fit a big disc in. And then we might start working on something like the steering actuator. I think I have a bit of reference material for that. I made a little sketch. how that could work. I may just do a pair of actuators connecting to each handlebar. It'll look a lot cleaner. It'll give us more space for the LiDAR systems. So I hope you enjoyed this. This was a really long video, but if you're enjoying this, let me know. Let's get some feedback, because I'm probably going to publish or start publishing these before I'm done with the entire project. So if I'm talking too much, if the videos are too long, videos are too short, let me know, and I hope you enjoyed it.